Hello everyone. Today we bring you a thrilling ghost story titled The Grave Robber, written by Hoyusi. This is the third story in our early week series that we proudly present on our channel, Ghost Stories of the Countryside. This particular tale is truly captivating and filled with suspense, promising to give you some spine-chilling moments in this video. So without further ado, let's dive into the story narrated by Ding's son. Doyen was a plain-looking girl, to put it kindly. However, she was kind, gentle, and modest. Fate led her to the north, where she met a handsome but idle young man who lacked any drive to work. And their marriage was hastily arranged by their families. But it eventually brought tragedy to the young girl. Just 6 months after the wedding, Doyen died unexpectedly, with no apparent illness. Her spirit kept returning, as if trying to convey something to her loved ones. What exactly happened to Doyen? Why did she die? What injustice lies behind her death? Let's find out together. In a small room on a street in the town, Buck had just finished an intense encounter with Tuyet, his lover of the past few months. He lay sprawled on the bed, letting Tuyet's hands roam over his body. "Oh, Buck, when are you going to marry me?" Tuyet asked in a sultry yet worried voice. "My belly is getting bigger by the day. Do you want the whole world to mock me for being pregnant without a husband?" Buck turned to embrace Tuyet, his face pensive. "I want to marry you, but my parents haven't agreed yet. Give me some time to convince them." Tuyet pouted. "Time? If we wait any longer, I'll give birth already. What do you expect me to do?" "Well, I'll bring you home and tell my parents that you're carrying my child. They'll have to let us marry," Tuyet suggested, her voice on the verge of tears. Buck sneered and said, "You think it's that easy? My mother isn't one to mess with. She's already declared that she won't allow me to marry a girl from." He swallowed his words, but Tuyet caught on. She sat up abruptly, wailing, "Your family thinks I'm a prostitute. What about you? Aren't you just some worthless scoundrel? Why don't they open their eyes and see that no one would look twice at you except me? Someone like you, even if offered, nobody would take." Tuyet cried hysterically. After venting for a while, she continued to berate Buck. "You're so cruel, Buck. Let me tell you, Tuyet is not someone you can mess with. If you don't take me to meet your family in 3 days, I'll stand in the market and tell everyone how heartless they are. If that doesn't work, I'll bash my head against your gate. Even as a ghost, I'll haunt your family for generations." Tuyet kept thrashing and yelling. Afraid that others might hear, Buck hurriedly covered her mouth and tried to console her. "Please stop. The more you say, the worse it gets. I never said I wouldn't marry you. I just asked for time to figure things out. To get my parents' approval, we need a plan. Instead of throwing a tantrum, help me think of a way. Making a scene won't solve anything." Tuyet slumped back on the bed, sulking. "Men like you are good for nothing. You sweet-talk me into bed with promises, but now, at the first sign of trouble, you're already backing down. It's so disappointing." Buck snapped. "Yeah, this is all I can do. If you're so smart, figure out how to win over my parents. You act like I'm the only guy around who likes girls. And weren't you the one who said you loved me, that you'd overcome any hardships with me, that you'd wait for me? Yet here you are, throwing a fit already." Let's talk a bit about Tuyet. She used to be a well-known prostitute in the provincial town and just turned 25. She entered this life at 16 due to poverty. Her father was an alcoholic, always violent, beating his wife and kids every day. Her mother couldn't bear it anymore and left, abandoning Tuyet and her sister to their addict father. Less than a year later, he died, leaving Tuyet an orphan. At the age of 15, Tuyet had to wander around looking for work, wandering everywhere until she met a madam. Seeing Tuyet's beauty, the madam immediately enticed Tuyet to work for her brothel. At first, Tuyet refused, but looking at the girls around her, some the same age, some younger, but already dressed up, with red lips and rosy cheeks, eating well, her heart began to waver and crave. Gradually, Tuyet could not resist the temptation and decided to enter a profession that was despised by the word prostitution. But Tuyet also knew that this profession only lasted a few years. The pistil withered and the flower withered. So she had calculated in advance, trying to save some capital while she was still young, to retire later and return to her hometown to get married. Yet Tuyet had been attached to that profession for nearly 15 years. As time passed, there were many younger and more beautiful girls in the province, and her position was gradually shaken. Thinking that she was past her prime, she decided to stop, retire and find another way to make a living. Then fate brought her to Bak. He was 3 years younger than her, but he was madly in love with her. Tuyet was still much younger than many girls her age. Returning to the district, she opened a vermicelli and bean curd restaurant in the market, relying on her mother's family business. Both beautiful and good at talking. Tuyet's restaurant was always crowded with customers, especially young boys and men who liked new things. During the day she sold vermicelli, and at night when there were customers, Tuyet worked overtime. Gradually, Tuyet's restaurant became famous throughout the commune, to the point that a retired school inspector came to visit. Soon enough, jealous confrontations began happening right at Tuyet's shop. One night, like many others, the retired principal sneaked into her house, unaware that his wife had set a trap. As soon as the door opened, several women leapt out from the shadows, storming in to catch them in the act. The principal was dragged away by his ear by his wife, but Tuyet was beaten mercilessly. If it hadn't been for Bak, Tuyet might not have survived that night. He had just returned from a card game when he saw Tuyet being attacked. He rushed in to break it up, threatening to call the local authorities. Only then did they let her go. To show her gratitude, Tuyet agreed to start a relationship with Bak from that day on. After a heated argument one day, Tuyet and Bak sat in separate corners, each lost in their own thoughts. After a while, Bak finally spoke up. "Listen, I'm being honest. I'm having financial problems right now. Do you have some money you could lend me to settle my debts? Maybe then my parents will see you differently and we can get married." As soon as Tuyet heard the word money, her anger flared up. She snapped, "Money, money, money. That's all you ever think about. Look at me, what do I have left? Since the day I met you, I've given you everything. You took all my savings, and now I have nothing left." Bak responded in a harsh tone, "Fine, if you won't help, I'll find another way. Don't talk about marriage anymore, even if my parents agree. There's no money for a wedding." With that, Bak stood up, threw his coat over his shoulder, and stormed out. By the time he got home, it was already late. He had purposely come back late to avoid facing his parents, but there was no escaping them. Mr. and Mrs. Nai were still awake, waiting. As soon as they heard the creak of his bicycle in the yard, Mrs. Nai rushed out, grabbed Bak's ear, and scolded him harshly. "You're good for nothing. You've been at that tramp's place again, haven't you? What kind of spell has she put on you that you can't stay away from her? Get in here, or I'll skin your life," she yelled, twisting his ear angrily. "Oh, my son, you're such a fool. A fish that doesn't listen to salt rots, and a child that defies their parents goes astray." But she hadn't even finished when Mr. Nai stormed out of the house, gripping an old broomstick, pointing it straight at his son as he growled, "You disrespectful brat. How dare you show your face here? How many times have I told you, and you still ignore me? Today I'm going to teach you a lesson." He advanced toward his son, raising the broomstick to strike. But Bak wasn't about to stand still and take the beating. He darted around his bicycle, pleading as he ran, "Father, calm down. Let's talk this over. Beating me won't solve anything. Please, Father, have mercy." Mr. Knight chased him until he was out of breath, sweating profusely. He finally stopped, panting heavily, still fuming with rage. "You wretched fool. If I hadn't just eaten, you'd be done for," he shouted. He threw the broomstick aside and walked back inside with Mrs. Nai, sitting down on the old wooden bench. Bak crept in after them, standing in front of his parents, mumbling, "Father, Tuyet, she's pregnant. Please let me marry her." Mr. Nai slammed his cup down on the table, his face turning red as if he'd been drinking. Mrs. Nai immediately started shouting, "Oh my God, how could you be so stupid, son? You're really bringing that wretched girl home to marry? What were you thinking?" Bak tried to explain, "Mom, you always badmouth her. Haven't you heard the saying, it's better to marry a prostitute and make her a wife than to marry a wife and make her a prostitute? She's changed since she met me. She doesn't see clients anymore." Now it was Mr. Nye's turn to get angry. He bellowed, "Shut up. I forbid it. I've already promised Mr. Hay from the upper village. You have to marry Duyan and no one else." Bat panicked. "Dad, I'm not marrying that head of Duyan. How could you make that decision without asking me?" Mr. Nye's voice grew stern. "I don't need to ask you. You don't have that right. Starting tomorrow, you're going to Mr. Hay's house to get to know Duyan." Bat refused and protested. "But why does it have to be Duyan? Why not someone else?" Mr. Nye huffed, glaring at his son. "Why? Open your eyes. In this village is district who is wealthier than Mr. Hay. If you're so capable, go earn enough money to pay off all your debts, then marry whoever you want. But since you have nothing to your name, you will marry her, whether she's hair-lipped, blind or crippled." Bat's pride was wounded, and he said angrily, "Dad, you're selling me off. If I can get a good price for you, I would sell you," Mr. Nye retorted coldly. "As far as I can tell, if I threw you out on the street, no one would pick you up." And hearing this, Bat fled up and shouted back, "I won't do it. If you want her so badly, then you marry her. I'd rather die than marry her." Mrs. Nye, who had been quietly picking her teeth, suddenly jumped up like a spring. "Oh, you brat. This marriage is for you, not for your father. He's not dead yet, so why would he go marry someone else? If you don't listen to your parents, you'll regret it. That Tuyet has completely brainwashed you. When you realize the truth, it'll be too late." Bat was frustrated, but he knew that defying his parents meant he'd end up on the street. For days he had been hiding from debt collectors. If they found Tuyet's place, he'd have no place to hide. Oh, but thinking of Tuyet, he tried to argue one more time, "But what about Tuyet? She's pregnant. Are you going to ignore your own grandchild? She's still family." "Oh, Mrs. Yeah, I cut him off immediately. "If you obediently marry Duyan, I can arrange something for Tuyet. I've just thought of a plan. We'll bring Duyan into the family first, and then I'll bring Tuyet in later. By then, what's done is done. Oh, and I'll persuade Duyan to accept Tuyet. It's normal for a man to have multiple wives." "Are you serious?" Mom Bak asked, skeptical. "Yes, absolutely," Mrs. Nye confirmed. Hearing this, Bat felt a surge of hope. He could have both money and the woman he wanted, two birds with one stone. The next day, he obeyed his parents and went to Mr. Hay's house to court Duyan. He boasted to Mrs. Nye, "Putting on an act is easy. If this village had a drama troupe, I'd sign up right away." Before heading to Mr. Hay's house, he jumped into a pond to soak his clothes, then carried a basket of fish that Mrs. Nye had prepared. He greeted Mr. Hay sweetly, said, "I caught some fresh fish and brought them over as a gift for you and your wife." From that day on, Bat regularly visited Mr. Hay's house, doing all sorts of chores from fixing the roof to helping Duyan collect duckweed for the pigs. At home, Bat never lifted a finger to help with housework, even when he had free time. But at Mr. Hay's house, it was a different story. Seeing how hard-working and eager Bat was, Mr. and Mrs. Hay were pleased, especially since he didn't seem to mind Duyan's appearance. Thus, not long after, a grand wedding was arranged. Duyan officially became Bat's wife and the daughter-in-law of Mr. and Mrs. Nye. A month after the wedding, Bat had enough money to pay off all his debts. But soon, he began craving his old ways of partying and fun. Memories of Tuyet and the passionate nights with her made his heart ache. Looking at Duyan, he felt nothing but gloom and dreariness. Comparing Duyan to Tuyet was like comparing a weed to a swan. During the day, he could clearly see Duyan's dark, rough skin and her higher lip, which made him feel utterly repulsed. Mrs. Nye noticed her son's frustration and reminded him, "It's only been a month. Be patient and don't do anything rash. Let me handle it, okay?" "But you promised," Bat grumbled. "Don't make me wait too long. I can't take it anymore." She shot him a glare. "If you can't control yourself, then cut it off. Honestly, you're useless." Bat retorted, "What are you saying? Cut it off? Then our family line would end." "Enough with the talking," Mrs. Nye snapped. "While you're waiting, you have to hold it in. Don't upset Dian, or things will get complicated. With that, she pulled Buck aside and whispered her plan. Buck nodded vigorously, agreeing to follow his mother's instructions. One day, as I was herding the buffaloes back home, I saw a strange girl sitting quietly in the house on the bamboo bench where Mr. and Mrs. Nye usually sat to drink tea. Mrs. Nye pulled Duane into the bedroom, her voice filled with dramatic sorrow. Buck made a terrible mistake. He got a girl from town pregnant, and now she's here with her belly and all. What are we supposed to do? Please, dear, have mercy on your poor mother-in-law. That girl, well, never mind her, but the child in her belly is family. Our blood. We can't just abandon it. Please let her stay here until she gives birth. After the baby is born, I'll send her away. Duane hung her head in sadness. She knew her place. Even though they had been properly married, her plain looks made her feel incredibly insecure. In a low voice, she replied, "Yes, mother, whatever you decide." Mrs. Nye sighed with relief, feeling like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She gratefully told Duane, "Thank you, dear, for understanding. You are still the official daughter-in-law of this family. That girl is nothing but a passing shadow, no match for you." She continued talking, hoping to soothe Duane's feelings. Poor Duane. As soon as her mother-in-law left the room, she collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow, crying her heart out. No matter how noble one tries to be, it's never easy to accept that your newlywed husband has already fathered a child with another woman. Seeing Tuyet's swollen belly, everyone could guess that the baby was about 4 months along. Tuyet used her pregnancy as an excuse to avoid all housework, spending her days lying in the bedroom, eating and sleeping. Mrs. Nye was irritated but couldn't do much about it, secretly cursing down this harlot. As soon as she gives birth, I'll kick her out. To make matters worse, Buck was always siding with Tuyet, saving the best food for her, saying that the family's heir needed to be well nourished. With Buck backing her up, Tuyet acted even more arrogantly, looking down on Dean at every turn. Duane, who had always been meek and compliant, felt even more miserable. However, Duane never confronted Tuyet, her husband's mistress. Deep down, she had come to accept Tuyet as Buck's second wife. Duane might have been gentle, but she wasn't foolish. She knew that Buck would never let Tuyet leave. As Tuyet's belly grew bigger by the day, Buck continued to treat her like a precious gem. Then, a little over 4 months later, Tuyet went into labor and gave birth to a baby girl. It was only then that Buck's dreams of a male heir slowly began to fade, and his pampering of Tuyet diminished. Especially after Mrs. Nye saw the baby, she bluntly told Buck, "There's your precious heir. Now you can pamper her all you want. As for me, I'm done." Her words were harsh. A child is still a child, and a grandchild is still a grandchild, but her disdain for Tuyet's background ran deep. She couldn't help but look down on Tuyet, even though she had borne her grandchild. After giving birth, Tuyet understood her precarious position. She knew she was on thin ice and could be thrown out by Mr. and Mrs. Nye at any moment. As a result, Tuyet became less arrogant and more subdued. She was extremely respectful to her in-laws and even more gentle and humble toward Duane. Gone was the smug, sharp-tongued woman she had once been. Whenever Tuyet confided in Buck, she would say, "We have to play it cool and sweet-talk Duane. All she has is money. If we're nice to her, I can get a bit of calf cash from time to time, otherwise we'd be left eating scraps." Listening to her advice, Buck encouraged Tuyet to be friendlier with Duane. It wasn't long before Tuyet would pull Duane to the room for heart-to-heart conversations, offering tips on how to dress and put on makeup to look prettier. Duane was happy with Tuyet's change of heart and appreciated having someone to talk to, which eased her loneliness. Life went on peacefully for Duane until an unexpected event shook things up. Since Tuyet had come to live with Mr. and Mrs. Nye, it had been almost 4 or 5 months. Gradually, the villagers began to uncover Tuyet's past and background. Rumors spread like wildfire, and people gossiped that Mr. and Mrs. Nye were unfortunate, bringing a prostitute into their home. They said their son had been corrupted by her, and the family's reputation had been ruined. The gossip hurt Mr. and Mrs. Nye deeply. Eventually, Mrs. Nye issued an ultimatum to Bach, demanding that he kick his mistress out of the house immediately. As for the newborn baby, she would take the child in, ensuring it was raised with a proper family name and not stigmatized by Tuyet's reputation. But Bach wouldn't listen. He was determined not to let Tuyet leave. The conflict between him and his mother grew more intense. Finally, Bach devised a plan and turned to Duyen, pleading with her, "Mother doesn't want Tuyet to stay here anymore, so I'll have to let her go. But she did give me a child, so I was thinking of buying a small house for her to live in separately, so she wouldn't clash with mom and dad. The only problem is, I don't have enough money. If you have some, could you lend it to me? I'll pay you back later." Doyen responded, "If I had money, I'd give it to you. You don't have to talk about borrowing. But when we got married, I gave you everything I had. I don't have anything left now." Bach, turning as ever, said, "I see you still have your necklace and a few gold pieces. Let me borrow those and I'll pay you back." Hearing him mention her dowry, Duyen refused immediately. "That was a gift from my mother. She told me to keep it as a safeguard or to use it only when absolutely necessary. I can't give it to you. Bach put on a sulky face and snapped, "Well, now is an absolutely necessary time. If you don't help, Tuyet will end up on the street with nowhere to go." At this point, Duyen couldn't hold back any longer. "Oh," she replied, "if you want to take care of your mistress, then you should do it on your own. Why drag me into it? You married me, and not even a month later you brought another woman home without asking for my opinion. Now you need to deal with yourself." Bach was furious at Duyen's stance. He had never expected this quiet, plain-looking girl to stand up for herself. Up until now, Duyen had always seemed meek and compliant, so he assumed she would be easy to manipulate. Feeling embarrassed, he lashed out, shouting, "Well, aren't you something? If you think you're so great, take that gold and get out of here. You're nothing but a toad, ugly and ungrateful. Having me marry you was the best thing that could ever happen to you. Without me, no one would want you." With that, Bach stormed out of the house, not looking back, cursing loudly as he went, "Damn it. Ugly inside and out. Why am I so unlucky?" As soon as Bach was out of sight, Duyen burst into tears. She quickly packed her clothes into a cloth bag, planning to return to her parents' home for a few days. But Mrs. Nye noticed and rushed over, snatching the bag from her hand, saying, "Let him be, dear. Don't take his words to heart. Even chopsticks clash from time to time. Let alone a married couple. Stay here with me. A daughter can't just run back to her parents' house every time something happens. What would Mr. and Mrs. Hai think of us?" Duyen then told her mother-in-law about how Bach had asked for her gold and how she had refused. Mrs. Nye was furious and said, "That good-for-nothing fool. When he comes back, I'll make sure justice is served for you." The next morning, when Bach returned, Duyen had disappeared. No one knew where she had gone. The entire family searched everywhere but couldn't find her. Mr. and Mrs. Nye were extremely worried. Bach, however, made a snide remark, "It's no surprise she left. She was just a spare part in this house." Mrs. Nye, already filled with anger, glanced at Tuyet and snapped. She rushed over, grabbed Tuyet by the hair, and slapped her across the face repeatedly. "It's all your fault. You wretched woman. You've destroyed my family and corrupted my son. Get out of my house right now." If Mr. Nye hadn't intervened and pulled her away, she might have killed Tuyet right then and there. Her face flushed, she sat down, breathing heavily, and then screamed, "It's my own stupidity. My own stupidity for letting this disgrace into my house and ruining our family. Oh God, how foolish I have been." The news of Duyen's disappearance soon reached Mr. and Mrs. Hai. They hurried to the Nye household to find out what had happened. Mr. Nye explained. That day, Bach and Duyen had an argument about something, and then Bach stormed out. Duyen packed her clothes to return to her parents' house, but my wife convinced her to stay. The next day she was gone. The buffaloes were still in the pen. So she didn't go to cut grass or collect duckweed. All the tools were still here. We searched the neighbors' houses, but there was no sign of her. We checked the bedroom, and her wardrobe was empty. She must have left in anger, Mr. and Mrs. Hai. Mr. Nai led Mr. Hai into Doyen and Bak's bedroom, showing him the empty wardrobe. Mrs. Hai looked at the empty closet, her eyes welling up with tears. Oh, my dear daughter, if you were upset, why didn't you come home to me? Why did you run away? My poor girl. She has suffered since birth, never whole like others. When she grew up, all I wished for her was to find someone who would truly love her. Doyen may seem quiet, but she is deeply emotional and loyal. I don't believe she would just leave over something so trivial. Hearing Mrs. Hai's words, Mr. and Mrs. Nai stayed silent. They knew she was indirectly criticizing them for allowing Bak to bring Toyet into the house right after marrying Doyen. Mr. and Mrs. Hai were clearly angry, though they kept their feelings to themselves. Mrs. Nai, usually quick with her words, remained silent today. It was Mr. Nai who spoke up. We deeply regret what has happened. Bak has been a terrible son, and we will certainly teach him a lesson. But first we need to find Doyen. Mr. Hai, being a calmer man, said, "You're right. We need to bring her back. She was wrong to leave without a word. Couples should handle their problems calmly and resolve them together." Mr. Nai nodded. "You're right. Why don't you come up to the main house for a cup of tea? I believe Din left out of anger and will come back in a few days once she's calmed down." Everyone sat around quietly, no one daring to speak. Toyet, meanwhile, didn't dare show her face. She sat quietly in the bedroom, listening intently to every word. After Mr. and Mrs. Hai left, the tension in the Nai household grew even thicker. Mrs. Nai kept glaring at Toyet's room, muttering curses under her breath. Meanwhile, Mr. Nai went around the village, asking everyone for any news about his daughter-in-law. In no time, the news of Doyen's disappearance spread throughout the village. Everyone blamed Mr. and Mrs. Nai for being too indulgent with Bak, allowing him to bring a prostitute into their home and mistreat his wife. People whispered, and both Bak and Toyet kept silent, not saying a word. By the 7th day, there was still no trace of Doyen. Everyone, especially Mr. and Mrs. Hai, began to worry seriously. They went everywhere, posting notices about her disappearance. Mrs. Hai, not minding the hardship, even went to another district to seek help from a well-known medium, asking her to perform a ritual to bring her daughter back. The medium asked, "Did you bring something that belongs to your daughter?" "Yes, I have her comb," Mrs. Hai said, offering the comb with both hands to the medium. The medium nodded, placed the comb on a plate covered with a red cloth, lit 3 incense sticks, circled them around the plate, and chanted softly. After a while, she opened her eyes and said, "All right, you can rest assured. Your daughter will return before the day is over." Mrs. Hai was overjoyed and thanked the medium with an offering before heading home. As soon as she arrived, she said to her husband, "I've asked the medium to call for our daughter. She said Doyen would return today." Mr. Hai was skeptical but didn't want to dampen his wife's hope. As evening approached and there was still no sign of their daughter, the sky began to darken with an incoming storm. Mrs. Hai anxiously looked out into the yard. "Oh no, how will Doyen make it back in this storm? Maybe I should take the raincoat and go out to meet her." Seeing his wife's concern, Mr. Hai sighed, "How will you find her if you don't know where she is? The village has 2 gates, the east gate and the west gate, not to mention all the shortcuts. You could be at one spot and she might arrive at another. Just stay here and wait." The medium said she'd return, so let's have faith. Even though he said this, he too was filled with anxiety, glancing out into the yard every so often. It was past dinner time, and the rain outside was getting heavier. Mrs. Hai paced back and forth from the porch to the living room, while Mr. Hai took a few drags from his tobacco pipe to calm his nerves. It was late, and still there was no sign of their daughter. By now, Mr. Hai had lost hope, thinking that the medium was merely a fraud. He turned to his wife and said, "It's late. You should get some rest. I'll stay up and wait for Doyen. If she returns, I'll wake you." But Mrs. Hai refused. "You don't have to worry about me. I'll sit here and wait. I'm not tired." Knowing it was useless to argue, Mr. Hai sighed and said no more. The couple sat quietly, staring out into the dark night. Close to midnight, Mrs. High suddenly heard a voice calling her. She quickly opened her eyes, grabbed her sandals, and took a lantern to the porch, calling out loudly, "Who's there?" "Doyen, is that you?" She saw a faint, shadowy figure standing by the fence, looking into the house. It was too dark to see who it was clearly. Filled with hope, she ran towards the figure, shouting, "Doyen, is that you? We've been waiting for you all day. Why are you just arriving now? Come inside, the gate isn't locked." But the closer she got, the further the shadow retreated. She cried, tears streaming down her face, "Doyen, come inside. Why are you standing out there?" The shadowy figure said nothing, just gazed at her with sad, hollow eyes. By now Mrs. High had recognized her daughter's silhouette. She cried out loudly, "What's wrong? Come closer so I can see you. Whatever it is, tell me." She rushed towards the figure, but it vanished, leaving behind only a cold mist. "Wife, what's wrong with you? Wake up!" Mr. High shook his wife, who had been crying and calling out their daughter's name in her sleep. "You were dreaming. Come back to bed." Mrs. High looked around, realizing she was still inside the house and not outside at the gate. Yet the dream had felt so real. Tears streamed down her face as her motherly instincts told her that her daughter was in grave danger. She recounted the dream to her husband, and he pondered, "Honestly, I've also had moments where I feared something had happened to Doyen. I know my daughter well. She's not the impulsive type. There's no reason she would stay away for so long. And if she had left, why didn't she come here? To her parents' home? She's always been timid, never had many friends, so where could she have gone?" Mrs. High was devastated, choking back sobs. "Maybe tomorrow we should go back to the medium. Let's find out if she's still alive." "That's probably the only option we have left," Mr. High agreed. Early the next morning, the couple quickly packed up, and Mr. High drove his wife to the medium's house. After performing the ritual and chanting some incantations, the medium held out a plate with a yin-yang coin in front of Mrs. High and said, "Your daughter will not return." Mrs. High's heart sank. She stammered, "What do you mean? Has something happened to our daughter?" The medium nodded, her voice steady. "I'm afraid your daughter has died. Her spirit can return, but her body has likely already decayed." Hearing this, Mrs. High broke down in tears. "Oh, my poor daughter. Why did you have to suffer so much?" "Oh." She turned to the medium and pleaded, "If my daughter is truly dead, please call her spirit so we can find out where she died and bring her home. No matter the cost, we will repay you for your help." The medium sighed, "This isn't about money, but I'll do my best." She instructed Mrs. High to sit down in front of the altar and draped a red cloth over her head to begin the ritual, calling for Doyen's spirit to return. Mrs. High shivered and swayed for a long time before finally calming down. "Is that you, Doyen?" the medium asked. Silence. "Oh, where is your body now?" More silence. "Oh, if you're suffering, speak up. Don't be afraid. Your parents will bring you home." But silence was the only response. After asking several questions without any answer, and with the time for the ritual coming to an end, the medium removed the cloth from Mrs. High's head. Her face was streaked with tears. The medium sighed. "I called her spirit, but for some reason she wouldn't speak." Mrs. High was desperate. "What do we do now?" "Let me cast a divination," the medium replied. "A person's spirit can move in 4 directions: east, west, north, and south. There are only 2 places for a body to rest: earth and water." The medium retrieved an old wooden tray from the altar, divided into 2 halves for yin and yang, marked with the 4 directions and 8 trigrams. After chanting prayers, she tossed a coin onto the tray times. Each time the coin landed facing east. The medium said, "Look here." 3 times the coin showed water and rolled towards the east. "This means there's water to the east. Your daughter has pointed us in that direction. Go back and search there." Mr. and Mrs. High hurried back to their village. To the east, the only water source was the river. As soon as they got home, Mr. High informed his in-laws and relatives, asking for their help in searching. 5 boats from the High family, along with villagers, scoured the river for days but found no sign of Doyen's body. Oh, in that darkest moment, Mrs. I cried out, "My daughter, it's your mother. If you can hear me, please come back to us. We're here to bring you home." She lit incense, prayed, and placed the incense sticks on a banana raft, setting it afloat on the river. Moments later, someone shouted, "There's a body floating this way." A few young men rowed out to retrieve it. When the body was brought to shore, Mr. and Mrs. Hai, Mr. and Mrs. Zai, and Mrs. Nai, and Buck all fell to their knees, crying uncontrollably. "Dwayne, how could this happen to you? Why did you leave us like this?" The body was swollen, decayed beyond recognition, with parts eaten away by fish, exposing bone, an utterly horrifying sight. Amid the grief, a villager spoke up. "Wait, before you mourn, check for identifying features. The body is too disfigured to be sure it's Doyen." Oh, he was right. Normally, Doyen could be identified by her lip, but the entire face was now destroyed. Through tears, Buck said, "It's her. The clothes are hers. Oh, Doyen, if I've wronged you, you should have told me. Why did it have to come to this?" Mrs. Hai examined the body closely and spotted a scar under the matted hair. "It is Doyen. This scar. She got it as a child when she fell from the jackfruit tree. This is my daughter." No one doubted it any longer. They brought the body back, prepared it for burial, and laid her to rest immediately, as it had been in the water for many days and couldn't be kept any longer. Doyen wasn't an only child, but she was the only daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Hai. Her sudden death devastated them. While preparing Doyen's body for burial, Mr. and Mrs. Hai placed many valuable items in the coffin, believing that she would have everything she needed in the afterlife. After the funeral, Buck and Toyet decided to leave Mr. and Mrs. Nai's house to start their own life elsewhere. Buck said, "If my parents don't want me here, then fine, we'll leave. Staying here only brings gossip and slander. It's deafening, and we'll go crazy if we stay." Mrs. Nai screamed at them, "Get out. Both of you, get out of my house. Never show your faces here again. It's like raising snakes in my own sleeve, letting foxes into the hen house." Buck and Tuyet took their young child and moved back to the district town, renting the small house Tuyet used to live in. Looking at the cramped space, Tuyet shook her head. "This old place is tiny. It was fine for 2 people, but now with the child, how are we supposed to live here?" Buck snapped, "What more do you want? At least we have a roof over our heads." Tuyet pouted, "But we have some money, don't we? Figure out a way to buy us a decent house, something suitable for a family." But Buck glared at her. "What money? I don't have any." Toyet, with a sly grin, replied, "Don't pretend with me. I know you have Doyen's gold. That should be enough to buy us a house." Buck narrowed his eyes at her. "You can sniff out money better than a dog. That gold might be enough for a house in the village, but here in town it's not enough. If you're so smart, figure out how to get more money, and then we'll buy a place." Tuyet pondered for a while and then whispered to Buck, "I saw Mr. Hai put a lot of valuable things in Doyen's coffin, including gold. I even saw Mrs. Hai put a ring on her finger and place some in her mouth." Buck's eyes widened in horror. "Are you suggesting we rob Doyen's grave?" Tuyet nodded, making Buck shiver. He swallowed hard. "Are you crazy? That's disgusting." Tuyet continued to persuade him. "Think about it. There's a stash of gold down there in that grave. If we don't take it, someone else might beat us to it. If we're too slow, we lose out. Imagine it's so much gold. We'd be fools to leave it there." Buck sat silently for a moment, letting Tuyet's words sink in. The thought of glittering gold danced in his mind, making him gulp. His chest heaved with nervous excitement, and then, gathering his courage, he slapped his thigh and made up his mind. "All right, if we're going to do this, let's do it. Tomorrow night we're taking action, and you have to help." At exactly 7 p.m. The next day, Buck dropped their child off at Mr. and Mrs. Nai's house with a few vague words before sneaking away with Tuyet to the cemetery. In the darkness, the two schemers hid in the bushes, waiting for the dead of night before creeping over to Doyen's grave. The graveyard was eerie and cold, sending shivers down their spines. Tuyet shuddered. Why is it so cold here? Buck snapped. This is where the dead live. It would be weird if it wasn't cold. Oh, since the grave was newly dug, the soil was still soft. Buck pulled out his tools, took out a crowbar, and muttered, Doyen, don't blame me. You're dead now, and the gold won't do you any good. Let me use it to start a business. I promise to make offerings for you every year. With that, he raised the crowbar and struck it into Doyen's grave. As soon as the crowbar hit the ground, a gust of wind howled, blowing smoke from the incense sticks on the altar. Buck and Tuyet turned pale with fear. Tuyet urged, hurry up. Why are you hesitating? It's about to rain. She grabbed the shovel to help Buck dig. Within half an hour, they uncovered the lid of the coffin. Panting heavily, Buck used the crowbar to pry open the lid. As he removed the first nail, he heard a faint giggle echoing around him. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He glared at Tuyet and shouted, You crazy woman. Why are you laughing? Can't you see I'm tense enough as it is? Tuyet snapped back. Are you insane? I didn't laugh. Just hurry up and stop talking nonsense. Buck, unsettled, returned to work, thinking he must have imagined it. As he pulled out the third nail, he heard a soft voice whisper, Buck, have you come to visit me? This time he broke into a cold sweat, his hands trembling as he held the crowbar. Tuyet, did you hear that? Tuyet scolded him. For heaven's sake, hear what? It's just the wind and thunder. Buck tried to calm himself down, telling himself it was just his imagination. He stuffed cigarette filters into his ears and kept working, pulling out the remaining nails in one go. After finishing, he and Tuyet rubbed medicated oil under their noses and slowly pried open the coffin lid. A rancid stench filled the air, overpowering the smell of the medicated oil. Buck gagged and spat repeatedly, while Tuyet almost vomited up her dinner. Both of them, holding their noses, shined their flashlights into the coffin. Tuyet quickly searched for Doyen's fingers, while Buck pried open the corpse's mouth. His hand trembled as he touched Doyen's face. Her appearance was horrifying. The hair lip had been eaten away by fish, exposing her gleaming teeth. As Buck tried to pry open her mouth while keeping an eye on her fingers, he suddenly screamed in pain. I'm done for. I'm done for. Startled, Tuyet shone the flashlight toward him and saw Doyen's teeth clamped tightly around Buck's finger. Sweating profusely, she grabbed his hand and yanked it free. Buck winced in pain. This is a nightmare. I'm injured, and we haven't even gotten the gold yet. Frightened and angry, Buck kept working while Tuyet struggled to remove the ring from Doyen's swollen fingers, which had become so bloated that the ring was firmly stuck. Tuyet urged off the finger. Impatient and frustrated, Buck followed Tuyet's suggestion, grabbing a knife and slicing off the finger wearing the ring, dropping it into a cloth bag. Still eyeing the ring in Doyen's mouth, Tuyet tried one last time to pry open the dead woman's jaws, but though terrified, Buck helped. After rummaging around with no success, they finally decided to stop. Just as they were about to close the coffin, Buck froze, a chill running down his spine. The flashlight beam passed over Doyen's face, and her eyes were wide open, staring straight at him. They fled the cemetery, not stopping until they were far away. Only then did Buck dare to pull out Doyen's severed finger and pry off the 3 rings before throwing the finger to the ground. The two scoundrels then headed back to their rented house. Exhausted from their grave digging, both collapsed onto the bed without even looking at their loot near dawn. Buck woke up feeling suffocated, like something was pressing on his throat. He groggily opened his eyes and saw Tuyet's arm draped across his neck. All-eyed, he grabbed it and pushed it aside. But after a moment, the arm returned to its position. Frustrated, he was about to bite Tuyet when he suddenly realized in horror Tuyet's hand had only 4 fingers, one was missing. Buck panicked, trying to shout Tuyet's name, but was paralyzed with fear. He looked at her face and recoiled in terror. Her face was grotesque, swollen, cracked open, with her teeth exposed because her lips had decayed away. Her eyes were wide open and lifeless. Bat screamed and thrashed, falling off the bed. He crawled toward the door, trying to escape, but it wouldn't budge. On the bed, the ghastly figure of Tuyet slowly sat up, staring straight at him. Bat sobbed, bed, banging his head on the floor. Please forgive me. Please spare me. Suddenly, 2 sharp slaps landed on his face, followed by the blinding light of the room. Tuyet's voice rang out, Bat, what's wrong with you? What kind of nightmare are you having? I'm not a ghost, why are you so scared? Bat regained his senses, looking around the room. Everything was normal. It was just a nightmare. He wiped his tears and stammered, it was horrible. I dreamed that Duin had turned into you, scaring me to death. Tuyet scoffed, glaring at him. You're such a coward. Useless. Just go back to sleep. She lay down and fell asleep quickly, breathing steadily. But Bak couldn't sleep. The image of Doyen in her grave haunted his mind. The next morning, he woke up with dark circles under his eyes. Tuyet paid no attention and urged him, go find us a bigger, more comfortable house. In a few days, I plan to reopen the noodle shop, my family's traditional business. It'll be a hit. Nodding, Bak put on his shirt and headed out. Tuyet stayed behind, admiring the gold they had taken. She saw Doyen's necklace glowing with a rich golden hue and put it around her neck. With a greedy grin, she muttered, it'd be a shame to sell this right away. I'll just wear it for now. She strutted in front of the mirror, admiring herself. Suddenly she screamed and jumped back, frantically clawing at her neck. In the mirror, her neck was covered in snakes. A whisper filled the room, do you like wearing my gold? Come to my grave and I'll give you more. The snakes tightened around Tuyet's neck. Her mouth gaped open, her eyes bulging, but she couldn't make a sound. Moments later, her hands fell limp and she collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Meanwhile, Bak went out to look for a house to buy, but luck was not on his side that day. At the first house, the owner took one look at him, immediately waved him away, shut the door, and released his dog as if Bak was some kind of demon. But the second house, the owner didn't turn him away, but their chained dog suddenly went berserk, broke free, and attacked Bak savagely. The owner couldn't calm the dog down and had to call the neighbors to help restrain it before Bak could escape. After wasting the entire morning and failing to find a house, Bak pedaled home, exhausted. On the way back, he had an accident and crashed into a tree by the roadside. Humiliated and sore, he dragged his battered body back to the rental house. Finding the house eerily quiet, he called out in frustration, Tuyet. Tuyet. The house remained silent. He muttered under his breath, where the hell has she gone now? Is there even any food? I'm starving here. He called out again, Tuyet. Where are you? Suddenly he tripped over something soft and squishy. Looking down, he realized it was Tuyet, lying unconscious on the floor. Panicking, he knelt down and shook her. Tuyet, what's wrong with you? Wake up. After a while, she finally regained consciousness. Seeing her husband, she clung to him and screamed, Ba, I saw a ghost. I'm so scared. A ghost. Calm down and tell me what happened. It was Doyen. She came back to haunt me. She turned the gold into snakes. Oh God, it scared me so much I fainted. You called me a coward last night, Bat mocked. Tuyet whimpered. What do we do now? I'm terrified. Exhausted, Bat collapsed onto the bed. I don't know, but I'm starving. Is there anything to eat? I had a miserable morning. Tuyet noticed he didn't seem to believe her and thought bitterly, he'll believe it when he sees it himself nonetheless. She dragged herself out of the house to buy food for him. When she returned with some food, Buck sprang up. Tuyet, I'm starving. She placed a bowl of porridge on the table. There was nothing left at the market, so I got you some porridge. Although slightly disappointed, Bat was too hungry to complain. But the moment he brought a spoonful to his mouth, he gagged. A foul stench hit him so hard that he nearly vomited. He shoved the bowl away, grimacing, What the hell did you bring me? Even pigs wouldn't eat this. Tuyet was annoyed. It's fresh porridge. You're just being picky. Try it yourself, then Buck snapped. Tuyet lifted the bowl and took a sniff. She immediately turned away, feeling nauseous. What on earth? When the vendor scooped it out, it smelled delicious. How did it turn so rancid so quickly? Both Tuyet and Buck were starving but had no choice but to head to another food store. Strangely, no matter which place they went to, that same rotten stench followed them, making them retch. Desperate, they went to a local healer. He prescribed a ton of herbal remedies, instructing them to take them before eating. But even with the medicine, they couldn't escape the horrifying smell. For days they were unable to eat, feeling as if they were on the brink of death. Gasping for breath, Tuyet finally said, Buck, I think Duyin is haunting us. Maybe we should return the gold to her, or we'll die like this. Oh, Buck, Furious yelled, return it? You were the one who pushed me to rob her grave, and now you want to give it back? You do it. I'm not going back to that cemetery, it's terrifying. But they were so weakened by hunger that they could barely stand it anymore. Defeated, they decided to go back to Mr. and Mrs. Nai's house for refuge. Maybe it'll be better if we go home, Buck mumbled. Since the day Buck left, Mrs. Nai had shown little interest in him and his wife. When they returned, she didn't utter a word to acknowledge them. Buck and Tuyet were forced to stay in the small room Tuyet had once occupied, too afraid to go near Duyin's old room. Back at his parents' house, at least the fear of eating had subsided, but other eerie things began to happen. Night after night, Tuyet's baby would laugh hysterically, sending chills down their spines. The cradle would rock violently as if someone was pushing it, and a haunting lullaby echoed through the house, leaving them both terrified and pale. Tuyet clung tightly to Buck, pointing at a ghostly figure in the middle of the room, her voice trembling back. A ghost. It's her. The most horrifying moments were when Tuyet fed their baby. Though the baby had no teeth, its lips would move, and an eerie voice would whisper, "Give me back my gold. Give it back." From that point on, Tuyet was overcome with fear and refused to go near her own child. Mr. and Mrs. Nai had to go around the village, asking nursing mothers for milk or straining rice water to feed the baby. Inside the house, Tuyet lived in constant fear, but stepping outside only brought scorn and whispers of contempt from the villagers. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Hai, after burying Duyin, had started to calm down. However, Mr. Hai began to doubt the circumstances of his daughter's death. He confided in his wife, "I don't believe Duyin committed suicide. She wasn't the kind to act rashly. Besides, what reason would she have had to take her own life? It was just a quarrel with her husband, nothing more." Mrs. Hyde nodded in agreement. Looking back, the way Mr. and Mrs. Nai behaved was odd, especially back. When Dwayne's body was found, he immediately identified it as hers, just from the clothes alone. Think about it, he'd left her days before and only learned of her disappearance later. How could he have known what she was wearing? Mr. Hyde continued, and she took clothes with her when she left. Why would someone planning to commit suicide bring clothes? The more I think about it, the more suspicious her death seems. Buck really is like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Back at the Nai household, Buck and Tuyet were tormented by Duyin's ghost day and night. They both became gaunt and frail, filled with regret but powerless to change anything. The stolen gold from Duyin's could neither be kept nor returned. Desperate, Buck took the gold and money to Duyin's grave, burning it while sobbing and begging for forgiveness. The news of Buck and Tuyet being haunted by Duyin's spirit reached Mr. and Mrs. Hai. Mr. Hai said, "If Buck had done nothing wrong to Duyin, then why is her spirit haunting him?" Mrs. Hai nodded. The Nai household is in chaos lately. I heard Tuyet is so terrified that she refuses to care for her own child. Mr. and Mrs. Nai have to go around begging for milk. Mrs. Nai is hiding in her room all day, taunting prayers, and Buck often goes to Duyin's grave to burn incense. I don't believe he suddenly cares so much for Duyin. With this in mind, Mrs. Hai suggested tomorrow I'll go over there and see for myself. When people are in distress, they're bound to slip up. The next day, Mrs. Hai bought some fruit and used it as an excuse to visit the Nai household, saying she was checking in on her sick son-in-law. She asked, "I heard your grandchild isn't well, so I came to visit. What's wrong with the child?" Mr. Nai replied sorrowfully, "We don't know. The couple is constantly arguing, saying there's a ghost haunting them. Toyet even claims the ghost has possessed the child and threatened her. Now she's abandoned the child, and we don't know what to do." Mrs. Hai sighed sympathetically. As a parent, it was heartbreaking to see one's children in such turmoil. She said, "I hope you won't take offense to what I'm about to say." "Go ahead," Mr. Nai responded. "Oh, if they're truly being haunted, they should visit the medium. She can help the spirit move on. If they've wronged the deceased, the medium can perform a ritual to ask the spirit for forgiveness. I've heard of cases where people were haunted for so long that it cost them their lives." Back, who had been eavesdropping from inside the house, heard every word. Panic gripped him. If they went to the medium, his secret would be exposed. There was no way he would go. A sudden thought struck him: he would run far away. He refused to believe Doyen's spirit could follow him to the ends of the earth. The very next day, the Anai household realized that Pak had vanished. He had packed his clothes, gathered what money he had, and fled without a trace. Only Tuyet remained, unwilling to accept her fate without a fight. The following day, she gathered the gold they had stolen from Doyen's grave, which Bak had left behind, and sought out a renowned sorcerer named Toon. Rumor had it that he had learned powerful dark arts in the northern regions, possessing skills to deal with malevolent spirits. Tuyet placed the bag of gold before the sorcerer, her voice filled with bitterness. "I'm being haunted by a spirit. Help me exorcise it, and this gold is yours." The sorcerer glanced at Tuyet, and then at the gold, a sly smile creeping across his face. "This gold does not belong to you," he said. "Where did you get it? It's tainted with a chilling aura of death." Tuyet shivered slightly but retorted with a cold voice, "Where it came from is none of your concern. What matters is that it's yours once you rid me of this spirit." The sorcerer maintained his cryptic smile. "You wish to pass this misfortune on to me? This gold belongs to the dead. Possessing it only brings calamity." Tuyet sneered at his words, showing her disdain. "So you're not as powerful as they say. If you're truly capable of exorcising spirits, why should you fear whether this gold belongs to the living or the dead? Are you helping me or not?" As she spoke, she grabbed the bag of gold and began to stand up, but the sorcerer stopped her. He chuckled darkly. "Why the haste? Sit down, dear lady. Let us talk." The sorcerer poured some tea, waiting for Tuyet to sit down before continuing. "I sense the spirit haunting you is filled with deep resentment. So much so that since you walked in here, the room has become cold and dark. Did you notice how I had to light more candles and incense than usual? As long as you remain within these walls, you'll be safe. But the moment you step out, the spirit may take your life before you even realize it. The longer this goes on, the stronger its grudge will grow. It will lose all sense of self and be driven solely by hatred. It will cling to you, seeking to destroy the one who caused its death. And if it isn't appeased, it might even harm innocent lives." Growing impatient, Tuyet interrupted. "What's the point of all this talk? I don't need to hear any of this. I just want to know if you can banish it or not." The sorcerer remained calm. "You're quite impatient. Yes, I can banish it, but you have two options. One, you repent and beg the spirit for forgiveness. I can assist in convincing it to let go and reincarnate peacefully. Two, I can destroy the spirit completely, leaving it with no chance of rebirth. The first option requires less money but more effort. The second option will cost you more gold, double what you brought here, because it requires more of my power." Tuyet considered this for a long while, her face remaining cold and emotionless. She fiddled with the gold necklace around her neck, the one that had belonged to Doyen but now bore Tuyet's name engraved after she had it altered at a jewelry shop. Gritting her teeth, she said, "That wretched girl has made my life a living hell. I've lost everything because of her. If only I could kill her again. I'll choose the second option. You help me first, and I'll give you the rest of the gold once it's done." The sorcerer nodded, a sinister smile spreading across his face. When Mrs. Hai learned that Bach had disappeared, she felt a deep sense of regret. She blamed herself for being too eager to uncover the truth behind her daughter's death, leading to more chaos. For several nights in a row, she dreamed of Doyen appearing before her with wide, desperate eyes, as if trying to convey something. Waking from these dreams, she was filled with unease, unable to sit still. Oh, it was clear to her that her daughter had died with unresolved grievances, bound to this world and unable to reincarnate. This thought made her choke up, tears streaming down her face. Early one morning, Mrs. Hai packed her things and went to see the medium Mo for the second time. At Mo's house, she poured out her heart. Mistress, these past few nights, I've dreamt of my daughter appearing, as if she has something to say. Please, I beg you to summon her spirit once more. I need to see her again. Last time, for reasons I don't understand, she couldn't speak. If she can't speak this time, please just call her. I will ask yes or no questions and she can nod or shake her head. Oh, the medium Mo agreed to help. After some incantations, a red cloth was draped over her head once more. In the dim, incense-filled room, Mo shuddered. Then Mrs. Hai heard Doyen's voice, struggling to speak. Mother, it's me, Doyen. Mrs. Hai hugged the medium tightly, weeping. My child, it's your mother. If you've suffered any injustice, tell me. I will clear your name. Oh, mother, I am in pain. Please, give me paper and a pen. Through her tears, Mrs. Hai gestured to the medium's assistant, who quickly brought over paper and a pen. Mrs. Hai watched as her daughter's hand scribbled across the page. Occasionally, drops of tears fell, smudging the ink. Mrs. Hai sobbed. Are you lacking anything where you are? Where does it hurt? What can I do to help you? The medium filled the page with writing, then looked up, her face wet with tears. I have to go now. Mother, please take care. Mrs. Hai gripped the medium's hand tightly, crying out, Doyen, my dear child. Oh, suddenly the medium let out a gut-wrenching scream, collapsing to the floor, her body writhing like a shrimp in hot oil. Mrs. Hai and the assistant rushed to her side, shouting in panic, Mo, what's happening to you? Doyen, are you alright? A trickle of blood flowed from the corner of Mo's mouth. Her body convulsed violently for a moment before she passed out. At Toon's house, Toyet was lying in the sorcerer's arms. After being satisfied, he looked pleased and gently caressed Toyet, saying, I'll banish that ghost for you. From now on, it won't bother you anymore. Inwardly, Toyet felt nothing but contempt for Toon, but she forced herself to appear compliant. From now on, I'll follow you. We are two people but one in spirit. She threw herself against Toon's chest. He gazed into the distance, his eyes gleaming with malice. The medium Mo regained consciousness after a long sleep. Seeing Mrs. Hai by her side, she immediately said, I'm afraid something terrible has happened to your daughter. Some dark magic has hurt her spirit. Mrs. Hai gasped in horror. What do you mean? Please explain it to me. The medium elaborated. It's as if a living person were beaten to the brink of death. Doyen's spirit has been attacked with dark sorcery meant to destroy her soul. Mrs. Hai began to wail again. Is there any way to save her? Crying won't help, the medium replied. Oh, the only way now is to take her incense burner to a temple, to let the Buddha's light heal her wounds, gradually releasing her from her suffering so she can find peace. Luckily, whoever used that dark magic didn't go all the way. There is still a chance for her to reincarnate. Hearing this, Mrs. Hai began to understand. Doyen's spirit must have been haunting Bach and Toyet. In their desperation, they must have sought out a sorcerer to suppress her spirit. Overcome with sorrow for her daughter, Mrs. Hai sobbed, my poor child. The medium consoled her, don't be too distraught. Do not interfere too deeply in the world of spirits. As the saying goes, one reaps what they sow. Those who commit evil will eventually face their own karma. Doyen has settled her debts. From now on, she can find peace in the Buddha's embrace and await her next life. Now go home and make preparations for her. 3 months later, in the village, people spotted a deranged young man dressed in rags, wandering the streets, picking through garbage. It was Buck who had disappeared months ago. No one knew how he had ended up in such a pitiful state. Some folks from the south recounted that they had encountered him on a train bound for Saigon 3 months earlier. Upon disembarking, he was struck by a motorcycle ridden by a drunk man who lost control. The crash left Buck severely injured. Although he survived, the trauma to his brain rendered him mentally unstable. His right hand was also severely injured, with one of his fingers sliced off in the accident. How he managed to find his way back to the village in such a state remained a mystery. Meanwhile, after taking Duyen's incense burner to the temple, Mrs. Hai and her husband visited Mr. and Mrs. Nai. She handed them the paper on which Duyen had written at the medium's house. The truth behind Duyen's death was laid bare. It all began with Tuyet. Aware that her mother-in-law disapproved of her, Tuyet sought to win over Mr. Nai. However, she went too far, often overstepping her role as a daughter-in-law. Duyen noticed this behavior and advised Tuyet to maintain an appropriate distance from Mr. Nai. Their conversation was overheard by Mrs. Nai. Consumed with jealousy, she stormed in, hurling insults and attacking Tuyet. In the chaos, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Duyen, caught in the middle while trying to break up the fight, was shoved by Mrs. Nai, hitting her head on a sharp corner. She died instantly. Panicked and not knowing what to do, Mrs. Nai called her husband and son to help her cover up the incident. It was Tuyet who suggested that Buck secretly dispose of Duyen's body in the river, fabricating a story that she had left in anger. Buck agreed but was so fearful of Duyen's spirit returning to seek revenge that he took a needle and thread to sew her mouth shut before dumping her body into the river. He also tied a stone to her feet, hoping her body would sink and never be found. However, the reason Mr. and Mrs. Hai found Duyen's body was that the rope used to bind her feet had rotted and snapped over time, causing her body to rise to the surface. Mr. and Mrs. Nai hung their heads in shame before Mr. and Mrs. Hai. Tears streamed down their sunken, weathered faces. Mrs. Nai fell to her knees, her voice choked with sobs. I am guilty of causing Duyen's death. I have been tormented by guilt ever since. I didn't dare confess the truth because I was afraid of going to prison. I am ready to face the consequences. Mr. and Mrs. Hai looked silently at the old, grief-stricken couple. Mrs. Hai finally spoke. We are here to let you know that we know the truth. We've done what needed to be done for Duyen. From now on, our families have no ties. Buck is no longer our son-in-law. You unintentionally caused Duyen's death, and we will not pursue it further. We have lost a daughter. And you have suffered too. We are all in pain. From now on, just try to live your lives well. Farewell. At Toon's house. In the dimly lit room, shrouded in smoke and incense year-round, a new tray covered with a red cloth had been placed on the altar. Toon had just completed another day of practicing his dark sorcery. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, lifting the red cloth into the air, revealing a pale, severed head beneath it. Around the neck of that head was a golden necklace with the name Tuyet engraved on it. Thanks for watching our story today. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more great stories. Don't miss out, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Bye, and see you soon.